In the last module of this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to concepts that revolve around modality. Whereas we normally think about claims as being true or false simpliciter, true here now, false here now. Right? Philosophers are also interested in modal claims, claims involving necessary, possible, and impossible. They're all modal statements. And these statements make claims about whether or not a claim must have been true, necessary, could have been true, possible, or could not have been true, impossible. So for example, 6 equals 7 is thought to be an impossible claim. It's necessarily false. On the other hand, 7 equals 7 is a necessary truth. It's impossible for it to be false. Oftentimes, philosophers will differentiate between a necessary condition for something and a sufficient condition for something. So why don't we think about those two concepts for a moment? Suppose we think that if a creature is a mammal, then it is an animal. Well, then we can make a claim about necessity here. Being an animal, A, is a necessary condition for being a mammal. You can't be a mammal without being an animal. We can symbolize that relationship using a conditional statement in a rough and ready way by saying, if you are a mammal, then you are an animal. So necessary conditions are often expressed as the consequence of conditionals. What about sufficient conditions? Well, again, suppose if a creature is a mammal, then it is an animal. Being a mammal, then, call it M, is a sufficient condition for being an animal. Call it A. So we can express that relationship by saying, if you are a mammal, then you are an animal. In other words, sufficient conditions are often expressed as the antecedents of conditionals. Now, sometimes we'll have assertions being made that state necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be an instance of something else. These are usually considered to be very rigorous definitions. So, for example, a shape is a triangle if and only if it's an enclosed three-sided planar figure. This expresses both necessary and sufficient conditions for triangularity. And we could restate this as saying, being an enclosed three-sided planar figure is both sufficient and a necessary condition for being a triangle. So ideally, definitions are going to give us sets of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for being an instance of a term or a concept that is being defined. This isn't always easy, but philosophers oftentimes want to formulate a theory of knowledge or a theory of justice by trying to formulate a definition, a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions to be an instance of knowledge, or to be an instance of a just act, or a just society, or so on. Another important contrast that Perry and his authors point to is the distinction between a necessary truth and a contingent truth. So they tell us on page 13, a necessary truth is a proposition that is true and could not have been false, whereas a contingent truth is a proposition that is true but might have been false. So 7 equals 7, that's a necessary truth. Wallace is your philosophy instructor, that's a contingent truth. It could have been someone else. The final distinction is a distinction having to do with modality in terms of way of knowing. So on page 13, Perry and his co-authors tell us that propositions can be known a priori, or that can be known a priori, are those that can be known completely independent of experience. So a priori, roughly translated from Latin, means prior to. So these are propositions that can be known prior to experience. On the other hand, propositions that can be known a posteriori, they tell us, are those that require experience of the world to come to know. So again, the rough Latin translation of a posteriori is after. So known after experience, or posterior to experience. So you can come to know that 7 equals 7 independent of experience. You don't have to experience a bunch of 7s to know this conceptual truth. Just like you don't have to experience a bunch of triangles to figure out that a 3-sided enclosed planar figure will be a triangle. On the other hand, a posteriori truths that you can only come to know after or through experience, involve relationships that can't be known, say, conceptually, but have to be known through seeing the relationship. So dogs are mammals would be an a posteriori truth. It's a truth that you could only know by having observed some dogs and classified them as mammals. You wouldn't know that a priori. Or chairs often have 4 legs. That is an a posteriori bit of knowledge. You don't know that just on the basis of the definition of a chair. You have to know that because you've seen a bunch of chairs and you've noticed that a lot of them have 4 legs. So that was the final module of our lecture on logical toolkits. This is a very dense lecture, so I encourage you to make sure you're familiar with the concepts, listen to component parts of it, or reread the article. Make sure that you're comfortable with all this terminology. It's a very dense lecture and chapter.